Kemachs, we have knelach and croutons, mem for matzah brai, and chaf for chalakugel.
And stuffing.
And they want so skemach, so put an S at the front, make a Yiddish skemach for the stuffing.
Yes, stuffing.
Zachor S Yom Shabbos Zakachay, and Shabbos darf mit essen. Zachor S Yom Shabbos Zakachay.
Yeah, we learned last night that some cipher says in Parshas Vayigash how important nutrikin, all the layers of the Torah are, and when you speak Lashon Kodesh, you get all the nutrikins. So we came up with a new nutrikin. Okay, we turn it over to, it's now 12 o'clock. We turn it over to the Rav.
And we didn't get to see if you'd Gimel probably, right?
Yud Gimel.
Yeah.
We did Yud and we did Yud Daled. What's Yud Gimel?
Yud Daled. No,
you said, 1 second.
we didn't do the one about donuts and about the dough. The Taisus or Tom.
No.
Okay.
Ramah Sif Yud Daled. Where's Yud Gimel? I don't have Yud Gimel here. You sent us Yud
Daled? No, we're good to go. That's Hashem.
Okay.
We're cooking bread and water.
Okay, so we're going to put up the Shulchan Aruch and Yud and Daled when you get to it. Yeah.
That's Hashem.
Yeah.
So over here we have Zas Sugya, a Sugya that is, we'll see in a moment, not only extremely Negea, but extremely Geschmack. And I admit that it's much easier for me to talk about the Sugya because I've already eaten, and talking about all this food to the Olam that hasn't yet eaten. But I suppose that's Lefum Tzara Agra. And the Maisa, the ganze Tainus of Asar B'Tevis is not a difficult Tainus, Kayadua. It's not the same level as a Tainus of the difficulty of a Tisha B'Av, not even a Shivas Arbatam, certainly not a Yom Kippur. The idea is that now, smack in the middle of the winter, the person just has to have a time to introspect and to reevaluate and to set goals and purposes till the end, until the end line, until he gets to Purim, until he gets to Pesach. So now that's what we're doing. We're in this big mittendrin in the middle of the winter, the Heilige winter Nacht, when it's, we're doing what the Heilige Bashefer wants, being moisif in Torah, even in a fast day when it's slightly difficult. So let's, amongst that difficulty, learn the Heilige Torah, the Geschmack Torah, the Torahs of bread, the dinim of Hamoitzi Lechem in Haaretz. The starting point, of course, is the Gemara in Lamed Zayin. Amid Aleph over here, the Gemara seems to say that Tanya, HaKoiseis Esachita Mevarach Bar Priyadama. That's what we spoke about last week. Tochna Afa. If he takes this wheat, this stalk, he takes it and he smashes it up, he grinds it up, and then he cooks it. So it depends. Bisman that the prusis are kayamis. He cooked it. First he baked it, then he cooked it. So it depends. If the prusis are kayim, you make a moitzi and you make a birchas hamazon. If ain't a prusis kayim, something about if the pieces aren't kayim, so then you make a mezainis and you make an alamechya. That's what it says over here in Brachos, on Daf Lamed Zayin, Amid Aleph. On Amid Beis, it says like this: Omar Ab Yosef, Hai Chavitza, this by Piruin Kizayis. Over here, it seems to make a differentiation if there's a Kizayis. So then we make a Maitzi. Now, before we spoke about Prusas Kayamis. And now, all of a sudden, we get into a whole new sprach. We start talking about Kizayis. Till now, we spoke about Prusas Kayamis. Now we're going to discuss if there's a Kizayis. And Behemet, that's going to be Taisus' Shaila. So Amar Rav Yosef, Hachavitza de Ispe Pirurin Kizayis, Betchili you make a Moitzi, and Lebasayif you make a Berch Samazin. If there's no Kizayis, you make a Berman Zayin, it's an Alamechya. And then Rav Yosef is Mayrich from Rayas, from Menachos, which we won't go into right now. In Besayif the Sugya, it says, Hochav in Mayaskin and Babab Milach and God, and Mayav Allah. So Gemara has a kasha, what's Lamaskana? Omar Sheshes. Hi chavitza avagav the lace bay piruin kazayis. The chavitza that doesn't have a kazayis, you make a moitzi. And amarava v'hudika teresa nahama. So now you have a tremendous amount of information and a tremendous amount of confusion. On Amid Aleph, it seems to say that if you want to know if something is a moitzi, what's the convey of something is a moitzi. So Gemara makes a differentiation. Is it prusis kayamis? The pieces are intact, or not the pieces intact? And that's what's going to be the determining factor. If one is going to make on it a moitzi and a birchas hamazon, or if he's going to make a mezainis and he's going to make only an alamichya. That's what it seems to say in Amar Aleph. On Amar Beis, it seems to say everything depends on kazayas and not kazayas. If it's a kazayas, you took this wheat, you ground it up, then you baked it, and then you cooked it. It seems to be, it depends if there's a kazayas or not a kazayas. If there's a kazayas, it's always a moitzi, birchas hamazon. If it's not a kazayas, mezainis alamichya. And then at the end of the sugya, it seems to tell us that there's a case of even when it's not a kazayas, so then it has now a new thing, a tsurisa denahama. It has the tsura of bread, whatever the tsura of bread is. But if it has a tsura of bread, then you still make a moitzi, even if it's less than a kazayas. So I have over here prusis kayamis. I have over here kazayas. I have less than a kazayas. I have tsurisa denahama. And all these things I have to put together and figure out what to do. Taisvis. In Brachos, Daf Lamed Zayin Mabei, the emissaries, there's the sheet of the Rashi, there's the sheet of the Rambam, and unfortunately, we don't have time to be married on all the sheetas, so we're going to go with Taisis and how the Shulchan Aruch Paskins really over here in Simin Kuf Samech Ches, basically Sif Tes and Sif Yud, and as we see, it'll spill over into Sif Yud Aleph and Yud Beis. Over here says Taisis, and now I'm going to tell you the klalim that come out of Shulchan Aruch Sif Yud, and then the Mishabura Sif Kat and Memtes. All based on Taisis, and then I'll read it to you inside Bez Hashem. The basic idea is that Taisis teaches us that Taisis Brachos, the first Taisis in Brachos, Daf Lamed Zayin Mabei, Taisis says, Rav Yosef is mefarish haprusis kayomis hainu kizayis. He says, Shnei achaloim is chaloim echas hein. They're both the same. There's no machlokes. When we say prusis kayomis, we mean it's kizayis. When we say it's ein prusas kayamis, we mean it's less than a kazayis, and that's a major determining factor. Now, again, we haven't yet finished, but that's stamazai klape what the words mean. And Taisus said this is explicit in the Yerushalmi. Then Taisus in Brachos Lamed Zayin Mabei adds lachein nirali a new idea. The chavitza. What is this chavitza? It's a pirurin, little shtiklach of bread that were stuck together ayidei soup, milk, honey, these types of things, like we find the chavitza de tamri. Now, Beisai, when you add all this up together, you get what it says in Shulchan Aruch, in Sif Yud, and the Mishabur and Sif Kat Memtes. And here's what comes out. There's going to be a chilik if you cooked it or did not cook it. Then there's going to be a chilik if kazayas or not kazayas. Then there's going to be a chilik if you didn't cook it, but it got stuck together al yedei, some type of a medium, perhaps milk, perhaps honey, etc. And then there's going to be a case of where there was no cooking done at all. And to make a long story short, I'll make it very clear, Bez Hashem, the first thing you have to know is that when there was no cooking and no sticking, and you take a piece of bread and you smash it up into 1,000 pieces and little dots, little microscopic dots, but you did nothing to it, even though those microscopic dots are mamish, the tiniest little pieces of bread. The halacha is you make on that a moitzi. If you take your bread and you make it into matzah meal, you take your matzah, you make it into matzah meal, you take your bread, you make it into breadcrumbs. The brachas on one breadcrumb, you make a moitzi. Derech agav, you don't make the bracha of Natil Sedayim when you wash. Do you wash? So the Mishabur brings down that even under a kizayis, lichatchila, a person is supposed to wash his hands for Natil Sedayim if he was having a breadcrumb, but he certainly doesn't make a bracha because you don't make a bracha by side until you have a kebeya of bread. So if a person decides he wants to have a spoonful of matzah meal, so then the halacha is you wash Natil Sedayim, you don't make a bracha, you make a moitzi. If you have a kazayis, make a birchas hamazon. If you don't have a kazayis, you don't make a birchas hamazon. People are sitting here wondering, what's a case where a person is going to have matzah meal? Who's eating breadcrumbs? What's his case? The truth is, this is explicit in Shulchan Aruch and Sif Tes. So even l'shma you have to learn it. Pas, gomer, afilu, pachas, mikazayis, you make a moitzi. Nothing, it wasn't processed, so therefore it did not lose the shem hamoitzi. And even though there was a havamina maybe in the sugya that you could have lost the shem hamoitzi once it got ground up into matzah meal, but the halacha l'maisa based on this taisus is that once it was bread and no process was done to it, only a grinding process, you ground up the bread into matzah meal, the bracha remains hamoitzi, and you make after it no bracha achrayna unless you have a kazayis, and then if you make a kazayis, If you have a kazayis, you make a Brachos Hamazon. Where's this Nageya? So like you say, that's why it's always good to learn, because sometimes you don't realize this can be extremely Nageya. And this is really the Mishnah Berurah. And the truth is more than the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah gives this Eitzah, the Bir Halacha gives this Eitzah. The Shulchan Aruch and Siman Tov Samech Aleph is talking about if a person is eating matzah, to be yotzei the mitzvah of matzah. So Shulchan Aruch says yotzei adam b'matzah shruya. If a person, you're allowed to be yotzei the mitzvah of matzah. The people that don't eat HaRav should cover their ears for a moment right now. But those that eat HaRav, you can take matzah, dip it in water, and eat the matzah. And you're yotzei the mitzvah of matzah. The only time it's a problem is like we'll see in a moment, when this matzah gets dissolved inside the water, then you can't be yotzei the matzah anymore. But if it was cooked matzah, so then you can't be yotzei because it no longer has the tam of matzah, as the Mishnah Berurah seems to explain over here. Then it doesn't have already the tam matzah. Lashon of the Mishnah Berurah, when he describes this, of Alin Bishla, he says, afilu if it would have a kazayis, so then already it doesn't have the tam of matzah anymore. Once it was cooked, it lost the tam of matzah. But let's say a person wants to know, can I take matzah and dip it in water? Is yotzei. Comes along the Bir Halacha over here, and this idea is based on a Prima Godim in Tov Samach Aleph and Mishpat Zav Sif Katan Beis, and he says, listen, let's say you have somebody who's a zaken and a chayla. Really, it's a Mishnah Berurah over here in Sif Katan Yud Zayin. Let's say you have somebody who's a zaken or a chayla, or he doesn't have teeth. How's he going to be out to the mitzvah of matzah? So the Mishnah Berurah brings over here. He says, look, very simple eitzah. Give this person, he doesn't have teeth, take the matzah, dip it in water, and let him suck the matzah and eat the matzah. And the Mishnah Berurah brings, that's a wonderful eitzah, and it's mutter even lechatchila to do this. Mishnah Berurah just brings down, be careful obviously not to soak the matzah in water for 24 hours, because then you're going to have the problem of kavish kum bushel. Kum to gain the Bir Halacha, and he says, that's a nice eitzah, but I have another nice eitzah. So I guess the Bir Halacha was having rachmanis on the people that don't eat HaRav. So for in this matzah, to be yotzei the mitzvah matzah, we're going to let you eat HaRav. But the Mishnah Berurah is having rachmanis on achenu that don't eat HaRav, and he says, what should a fellow do who doesn't brach? Zok there, yesh oid eitzah. It's hard for him to eat dry matzah, so you should take the matzah, grind it up, even like kemach, like matzah meal. Matzah, and you make a Brachos Hamazon, and you yotzei the heilige mitzvah of matzah, as a state in Rebbe Bir Halacha, based on the Prima Godim, and that's the klal. The Prima Godim says anything you make a moitzi, a Brachos Hamazon, anything that you don't make a Brachos Hamazon and a moitzi, you're not yotzei the mitzvah of matzah. And the Birkei Yosef, the Chidah and Tov Samach Aleph and Siv Katan Aleph, he brings down, he says, Nirishim imu zaken muflager chayla, let him take the matzah, grind it up, ukazayis matzah, dak, beli mashke v'aychel, let him just eat it, no problem. Sharei Pasak, and he brings our Shulchan Aruch, Siman Kuf Samiches, Mefayrer dak, if you take it and you smash it up and grind up matzah meal, you mevarich ha'maitzi Brachos Hamazon. And he says, I heard that this is what the Mari Abu Lafia did, lehisik nasai. And this is brought in the Shari Tshuva and Tov Samach Aleph and Siv Katan Beis. And like we mentioned, this idea is brought in the Bir Halacha. So this Abaisai is number one, that you have to know if it wasn't processed at all it was ground up, it's a moitzi, it's Brachos Hamazon, and you can be yotzei the mitzvah of matzah, beloy shum safek and beloy shum shalom. It's true, you won't have a shalom, but the HaKadosh Baruch Hu will understand, or maybe you could grind it up on Yontav Elaine. You'd start with a shalom, then grind it. You could dan if that would be a hefsek. Ein toichen achar toichen. Anyways, even if it would fall out on Shabbos, but Al Kapanim certainly is yotzei the mitzvah of matzah. I just want to be meisiv. Let's say, it's very difficult. Go and try and eat matzah meal. That's not an easy thing to do. It gets all powder, and it's very difficult to eat such a thing. So, kipshutai, even those that would eat HaRav would have an eitzah, let him put it in his mouth and then drink down the water. And that ready, I think many, even of the Chassidish Paiskim, are makel that wouldn't be considered HaRav. And certainly Kapei Artsig, that wouldn't be considered that it turned into the matzah flour has now lost its color and the water has turned white. That takes a while for such a thing to occur. And therefore, that would be the eitzah for somebody that can't eat. That's sivtas. And that's the first cloud. The second cloud based on Taisvis is what happens if he cooks bread that was previously baked, regular bread. What's the din? The way Taisus learns the sugya, it's a chilik, whether it's a kazayis or not a kazayis. Kloimar. Here, we don't care, sarisa danama, not sarisa dama. We will assume that if you cook something more than a kazayis, it still has the tsura of pas, because a kazayis has that certain level of chashivas. And under a kazayis, once you cook a piece of bread under a kazayis, it now lost the shame pas. It's a big side of Isai. And now you will make on it a mezainis. And even if you would eat thousands of them, for example, we'll see soon that certain croutons that they sell, certain ones they sell, they're just deep fried. But certain ones, they were baked bread, and then they take the bread and then they cut them up, and then afterward they deep fry them. In essence, they cook them. So let's say you have croutons, and you know that those croutons, after they had been baked, were then cooked. So then what's the halacha? Since they're all less than a kazayis, the halacha says Taisus clearly if they have lost their shem amoitzi. So if you have a bag of croutons, and I'm not going to today tell you, because every time I give the shear, I find out the ones in America, the soup ones, the salad ones, and the ones in America, and the awesome ones, and this one, they're all different, and they're all this. So right now, let's talk theoretical, and maybe if we have Siyata Shmaya, we'll try to see in the practical what is going on in the market. But in the theoretical right now, a crouton, which was a piece of bread that they slice, let's say you do it at home yourself. You want to make your homemade croutons. You take them, you slice them up into 100 pieces, and then you deep fry them in oil. Deep frying in halacha, we'll see in a moment, is called cooking. So if you bake it and you take something which is under kazayis bread and then you cook it, the halacha is clear that now it lost the shame bread. That itself is taking away the tzirisa de nahama. That itself is therefore mezainis. And if you eat the whole bag or even 10 bags after you get out of the hospital, you only make it ala michya. You do not bench because it lost the shame bread. Has nothing to do with the regular Shaila Pasababa Kistin, where after you eat a certain amount, you have to bench. After you eat a certain amount, you have to say Ne'ilu. But after you bench, after you eat a certain amount, you have to bench. Here has nothing to do with that. It no longer has the chshivas of bread. So that's how Taisus learns the sugya. Prusis kayamis means it's a kazayis. If it's a kazayis, when you cook it, it didn't lose the shame bread. Mashayin Kane, if it's under a kazayis and you cook it, it lost the shame bread. That's rule number 2. So again, rule number 1 is if I did nothing to it but just grind it up, hamoitzi. Rule number 2 is if I cook it, now it depends if it's a kazayis or not a kazayis. If it's a kazayis, it remains with the shame amoitzi. The third rule that Taisus says over here is, let's say I don't cook it. Okay, so now if I don't cook it, what's a shayluch or pachid amoitzi? But I take it, and now I do 2 things to it. Listen closely, because you need both things to down. Now we need how are we going to remove the shame amoitzi? Something was amoitzi, you got to remove that shame. One way of doing it is if you cook under kazayis. One way of doing it is if you take something which is number 1, ain't under kazayis, and number 2, you stick it together with a dvash or a marok or some type of a liquid medium, and you stick it together. And when you stick it together, it loses the tsura of bread. It doesn't look like bread anymore. So now, if you have both of them under kazayis and it doesn't look like bread because it was stuck together, and I'll give you an example in a moment. So then the halacha is going to be that on that is going to turn into a bayrei minei mezainis. So these are the 3 rules. Rule number 1, if you grind it, doesn't matter, not standard of processing, amoitzi. If you have the right amount. Rule number 2, if you cook it, depends if it's kazayis or not kazayis. Rule number 3 is if you didn't cook it, but you made it under kazayis and you were stuck it together in an oifen of where you don't see anymore the pas. You don't see that as a tzura of pas, and it was stuck together. So that is now going to be a mezainis. I'll give you an example. There was a yeshiva. Somebody mentioned that the Balkan found out, this is going back 30 years ago today, the yeshiva would be closed down for abuse or who knows what if you tried such a thing. But 30 years ago, there was a yeshiva that they wanted to fill up the bachrim. So what were they doing? They made the tuna with the leftover challah. Now, how do you make tuna with leftover challah? It's a very ingenious chef over here. He took the challah, he put it into a food processor, a blender, who knows what. He made it into matzah meal, and he basically put it into the tuna with oil, and it made the tuna thick. Nobody knew what was going on, but the tuna was quite filling. So afterward, the Balkan found out, and they wanted to know, what bracha do you make on this tuna? Do you make a moitzi on this tuna? Do you make a mezainis on this tuna? It sounds like a medrash pliya. That yeshiva, after yeshiva, and the yeshiva learned over here what it says in Shulchan Aruch Kuf Samech Ches. He says, look, under kazayas, stuck together with oil, certainly doesn't have the tzurisa de naham, but has the tzurisa de tuna. So he said the bracha in such a case is the chayra a mezainis, not even a shackle. It seems to be that the bracha on it's a good riddle. Where do you have a case where the bracha on tuna is a mezainis? I guess the answer is change yeshivas. But that, Rabbi Isai, are the three rules that come out of Taisvis, and that's basically in a nutshell what it says over here in Shulchan Aruch Kuf Samech Ches Sif Yud, based on the Mishnah Berurah Mem Tes. Chavitza dehainu, that's like the Shulchan Aruch, dehainu pirurei lechem. And now we just read the whole long Shulchan Aruch. Now it's very simple. Shenidbeku yachal edei marak. So it depends. If it's cooked, it depends. If yesh by kizayis, afapi that it wouldn't have a toyer lechem, it doesn't matter. You can't lose the toyer lechem. It's a moitzi lechem in a oretz. Once it has a kazayis, you can't lose it once you have a kazayis. Ain but kazayis, afapi that it would have a toyer lechem. Doesn't matter. Once you cook it, you lost it. It's a ber mizayis. In other words, bishul is an automatic mafkia for under kazayis, and you can't affect an over kazayis. Then goes on the Shulchan Aruch and he says, if there's prusis that are kazayis, but they were stuck together al yedei dvash, and who knows why? Again, you can't remove the shema moitzi. But if it doesn't have a tar lechem and it's under a kizayis, so that says the Shulchan Aruch. But if it's ain't a loy mevushal, loy mechuber, elamai, you just break it up into tiny pieces. Have a pea that it doesn't matter. Tiny pieces, and a person sees a speck of dust. It doesn't matter. The bracha is birchas hamoitzi, and afterward a birchas hamazayin. This is, in a nutshell, the whole Sif Yud. Now the Maisa. What's the hesber in this? I saw one sefer that he writes the l'chayra, this entire din. He says, how could you be mechalek between kazayis, under kazayis? HaRav, we know that yesh bishul achar afiyah. We know that bishul affects afiyah. So therefore, how could it be that I cooked a piece of bread, but because the bread has a kazayis, where do we find a chshivas of kazayis klape? This we found a chashivas klape surim of what point it has a chashiv amaf that you're going to be like or at what point you make a bracha chreina. But where do we find that it makes enough gemina klape affecting an item, that when something is a certain size, then the item can't get affected? Very difficult thing. Did you ever hear in Hilchos Shabbos that if something is more than a kazayis, we don't say ein bishul achar, we'll say ein bishul achar afiyah. Hard to understand. The bishul process is a chemical process, albeit on halachic understanding. But if you did that process to it, so then you did the process. What's the difference? More than a kazayis, less than a kazayis? So I saw one sefer that says, no, it can't be. There's really no real chilik between less than a kazayis and more than a kazayis. And bamis, once you cook it, it's over. You lost the shame bread minat Torah. Just more than a kazayis. The Chazal made a drabanan that it's still called abayitzi, and under kazayis they didn't make that drabanan. But more than a kazayis, really, it's also lost the shame bread once you cook it. Because once you cook it, it lost the shame bread. There's no difference, kazayis, not kazayis. It's a din derabanan to remain the kazayis shame. One's at a shame of hamoitzi, so you can't lose that shame. But it's only a din derabanan. This Rabbi Isai, you might be able to say when you learn Kuf Samech Ches, but once you learn what we just mentioned a minute ago, Taf Samech Aleph, you'll see that it's not going to go. It's not emes, because over there you see that this din of cooking a piece of bread when it's more than a kazayis, that the shame bread remains, is a din deraisa klape matzah. Why? If you read the Mishnah Berurah over there, the Mishnah Berurah says murder kazach. He says, if you take that same Mishnah Berurah that we spoke about before, so Mishnah Berurah says, if you take a piece of bread of matzah under kazayis and you cook it, he says, of course you're not yaitze the mitzvah of matzah. It's no longer bread. It doesn't have a shame bread. So of course you can't be yaitze the matzah. So then the Mishnah Berurah has a question. So then why do I need to come on, like the Gemara says, that if you cook matzah, you're not yaitze because it doesn't have a tam matzah? Just say, I'm not yaitze matzah because it's not matzah. What do you mean it doesn't have a tam matzah? It doesn't have a tam matzah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, I'll tell you why I need that. For under a kazayis, like the Mishnah Berurah, of course I don't need that, because once it's under a kazayis, it's no longer bread. So no longer bread, no longer amaitzi, no longer matzah. Matzah ain't to the Mishnah Berurah, but what if it's more than a kazayis? Says the Mishnah Berurah, go and look in Hilchos Brachos, and you'll see that when you cook something, a piece of matzah, more than a kazayis, so then you'll see over there that when you cook something more than a kazayis, then the bracha remains, and it's still a moitzi. So you see, it still has a shem lechem. Now the Mishnah Berurah is talking about matzah, the mitzvah deraisa, and he says it still has the shem lechem. And that's like the Mishnah Berurah. That's why I need to come on to doesn't have a tam matzah. For the case of where it does have a shem lechem, but it doesn't have a tam matzah once it's more than a kazayis. So this Mishnah Berurah is explicit that the chilik between more than a kazayis and less than a kazayis is a chilik min haTorah. Now, what is that chilik? Olam Kedan. It's a big chiddush. This sefer is correct in his question that l'chayra more than a kazayis is not a svara to mafkia to not mafkia shem bishul and only less than a kazayis. Maybe yeah, maybe no. Maybe you should ask it to a scientist. I don't know. But does state. But upon him, does survey sign is the first decide that we need to know. More than a kazayis, you can't remove the shem bread. Less than a kazayis, you could. How do you remove it? Either through a bishul process or a deep frying process, or by sticking it together with some type of a liquid medium in whereby you lost the tsura after it was stuck together. That's Rabbi Yisai is number one. Now, you can go one by one, Rabbi Yisai. What exactly is boch atadinu lihen melchaylam? You can go, Rabbi Yisai, now, one by one, to try to figure out over here what exactly is the bishul process that we're discussing. And this, we'll see, it's based on a lot of the klalim of Yeridea. We'll just do a little chazar over here. Example, question number one. How much bishul is called bishul? When we say that you mavashal these pieces that are under kezesim, and that's how you were mafkia the shem hamoitzi. So how much bishul did you do? Klaimar be'eiches. Does it have to be fully cooked? I fully cooked this piece of bread, or Michael ben Jusai. Here comes the Chazanish and Arichaim Simichavav in the beginning of his test, and over here the Chazanish says that when we talk about bread that was nisbashal, that lost the shem hamoitzi, and now turns into mezainis, he says once it was Michael ben Jusai, that's it. Again, what exactly is Michael ben Jusai? A third of the cooking process on a piece of bread? I don't know, but at least in Lumdis, you understand it. Then the Mishnah Berurah and Sivkot Nun Beis brings down a very famous machlekes. Everyone knows the Taisvis on Daf Mem Beis, I think it was Taisvis in Zvachim, very famous. When we say bishul, what about irui? What if I take boiling hot water and I pour it with a stream of boiling hot water onto something? We know in Hilchos Kashrus, the whole Hilchos Kashrus is based on this. We know all over in Halach and Hilchos Shabbos, irui is kimavashal. That's why you can't pour boiling hot water onto, certainly not tea, but even onto other things, because irui is kimavashal. But we know it's a suffix if irui is kimavashal. Rabbeinu Tam and Rishpam and Big Machlekes. So what about over here? Let's say I take boiling hot water and I pour it onto something which is under gezayis. I guess it would have to be something like breadcrumbs, because irui, no matter what, is only mevashal kadei klipa. But let's say I take boiling hot water and I pour it onto a bunch of breadcrumbs. Are those breadcrumbs now, were they affected by a bishul process to such an extent that therefore it lost the shem pas because you were mevashal less than a gezayis? Or do I say, no, irui is not mevashal? Here the Mishnah Berurah says it's a suffix. He says if you poured boiling hot water, very negaya, let's say a person makes some type of a matzah meal dish, and he pours boiling hot water straight from the kettle onto it. So is that bracha now a moitzi, or is it a mezainis? Over here, the Mishnah Berurah is not willing to say, again, that usually we're very machmir on irui to consider it to be a deraisa. Here's one of the few cases where the Mishnah Berurah shows that be'emes it's a suffix, and that in all the other places where we were machmir, it was the pshat that we were being machmir. Here the Mishabura says, it's got nun base. I mean, niach perurim on a kaira, and you poured boiling hot water on them. He says the Achrayim say it's a suffix if it has a din of bishul or not, and therefore he says it's a big problem. Therefore he says pater it, only eat a different piece of bread and pater it up. So now we know it has to be Michael ben Rusai, and now we know Iroy is a suffix. What about klisheni? Now, by side, there are them over here. I think we were Zeicha together, Abba Yisai, whoever remembers, to learn together, Hilchos Bishul. So, you know the answer to this. L'chayra, Kli Sheni, when it came to Hilchos Shabbos, we were machmir on Kli Sheni when it came to Hilchos Shabbos. So, L'chayra, if you're going to take boiling hot water and put it on less than a kazayas piece of bread, L'chayra, just like in Hilchos Shabbos, we said you can't do that on Shabbos. You're allowed to take, Rabbi Yisai, a piece of challah and put it into your soup on Shabbos, avadanat, unless your soup is a kli shlishi, or unless your soup, maybe if there was a ladle in between, the Mishabru is willing to be mekel. But we're machmer on a kli sheni, Shulchan Aruch Siman Shin Yud Ches, Siv Hey. So we would expect that over here, somebody's going to ask us, if I take a piece of challah under a kazayis and I put it into a cup, kli sheni, of boiling hot water, we would expect that such a thing you shouldn't be allowed to do. Kloimar, you can do what you want, but we would expect that now we have a major suffix because it's at least a suffix. Klisheni was always a suffix by us. And therefore, I don't know if it's a moitzi, I don't know if it's a mezainis, meaning did the bishul process over here affect the less than a kazayis and take away from the shema moitzi? We would have expected that this is a suffix. And over here, this Mishnah Berurah is shocking. I tell you, Rabbi Sai, these Mishnah Berurahs are sneaky ideas. You have Eroy, most people in the world think it's Medina that we're machmar and Eroy, Bain in Kashrus, Bain in Shabbos. And most people think that Kli Sheni, we're always machmar and it's always a suffix. Over here, the Mishnah Berurah reveals an incredible piece of information. The Mishnah Berurah reveals to us, he says in Sivkatan and Beis, Kli Sheni is not bishul. I know Kli Sheni is not bishul, but we're machmar. No. The Mishnah Berurah's shita is that all those places that you find that we're machmar by Kli Sheni, that's because Chumrah the Shabbos, or by Kashrus, because by Kashrus who says we need bishul, maybe it's enough just a transfer of blias. But when you want to know 100% is Kli Sheni called bishul, over here in the Mishnah Berurah he says it's not haraya. He says if you take a chatzi kazayis of bread, put it into a Kli Sheni, Mishnah Berurah says that's not called bishul. It's so not bishul that the brachos are moitze and you didn't mafkia. Now here you can't say the Mishnah Berurah is being machmir, because if he would have been machmir, he would have told you like he told you before to have it only in the middle of a suda. So over here, Mishnah Berurah brings down the l'chayra, you didn't lose the shein bread if you put it into a Kli Sheni. Now you could ask, what do you mean by Shabbos we're machmir? So I guess you have to say, yeah, Shabbos is a chumrah. Shabbos is a chumrah. And here it's actually quite ironic and quite incredible. Abaisai, what's the din of kavish in Hilchos Shabbos? If a person pickles something, he leaves something for 24 hours. We know in Hilchos Kashrus, Yeridei Siman Kufay, if a person takes a piece of meat and he soaks it in a piece in a milk for 24 hours, or a nevela, he soaks in let's say a nevela inside his kosher chicken soup for 24 hours. So the halacha is that kavish is kimavushal, and we say that it's like as if you mavashled it, and therefore it's usher by bas v'chol. It's only the rabbanon because it's not derech bishul, but by kashrutz it's an issa deraisa mamish. Kavish is kimavushal. As a mela, if we know that kavish is kimavushal, what should be by Hilchos Shabbos? Is kavish kimavushal midaraisa? On Shabbos, if a person was kovish something, he pickled something, takes pickles, he takes cucumbers and he pickles them. Is he over in a deraisa? Absolutely not. You're asking that it's not. So over here, this is where it gets unbelievable. What if I take a piece of matzah bread and I soak it in water for 24 hours? Did I now change a piece under kazayas, obviously? Did I now change the bracha from a mighty to mezainis? So over here we would expect to say, well, kavish isn't kimavushal by Shabbos, so it can't be. And over here says the Mishnah Berurah, not by us. In Tav Samach Aleph, you've guessed it, the one we just read, Tav Samach Aleph, Siv Katan Yud Zayin. Over there, the Mishnah Berurah brought down, if you remember, that what does a zaken v'chayla do? He could take the matzah, dip it into water, But he says, don't do it for 24 hours because then it'll be a problem of kavish kimevushal. He said, don't do it many slices. But what do you see? What happens if it's kavish? So it sounds like from the Shbura, but he says, Sarkli Zoyer, that he shouldn't do it for 24 hours because kavish is kimevushal. Now you could dan. Maybe so therefore you see it's like mevushal. So therefore if you do it for under kizaisim, if you do it for under the size of a kizayis, so therefore l'chayra here by us also, it would no longer have the shame of a hamaitzi or bimazainis, but you could dan. Maybe the Mishabura just means over there by chametz, it'll be mevushal and it won't have any more a time of matzah. But you don't know what'll be in our sugya if a person were to take a less than a kazayis piece of bread and soak it for 24 hours. The truth is, B'derek, once he does that, it's going to make the water white anyways, and we might have what it says over here in Sifid Aleph. But Akapanim, that's the klal. Afkamina is chalakogel. Now, I don't know how you guys make chalakogel.
Chalakogel, we discussed chalakogel, and we are waiting for you to tell us what's with chalakogel.
But how do you guys make chalakogel? That's before we start.
Now you're over my pay grade. No idea. How do you make chalakogel? Anybody?
No, because there's different methodology. The one I'll describe, which is the one ich hab gesehen in the Heim, was haben sie gebracht from Minkach. That's what we gesehen. That's what we saw. Azayit getin the Darke Tshiva, and Azayit getin the Rebbitzin, versteht sich of the Darke Tshiva, and the Svalje for Rebbitzin, haben Azayit getin. This is an incident mishpuche, is they would take the challah, they would break it up, and then they would put it together again with egg and then they would basically bake it. So they would take it with mamish brekel it apart and then put it together with egg. And then they would basically, sometimes they threw in some other things over there, whatever they could find, maybe a broken chair or something. And that's how they would make it.
What do you mean? They would bake it again? They would bake it again?
Yeah, they would basically bake it again. But sometimes they would put in a rosemary paris, like juices. They would bake it again.
Right, so I'm saying there's no bishul involved in this process.
Yeah, they don't take it, and sometimes they soak it. I mean, first they have to brekel it apart. So the way they brekel is they soak it a bit, and then they put it with egg together.
So that's covers, right?
But they're not soaking it for 24 hours. So now, Lamaisa, when they take it and they put enough egg in it, so the egg most of the time is the roiv. So since the egg is the roiv, the Mishnah, which we'll see soon, seems to say if that's the case, so then you were mafkia and you turned it into a bar yamin mezainis. Because now you took challah, broke it up with roiv mei paris, baked it back together again, but you baked it back together again with a roiv mei paris, and the egg is considered a roiv mei paris. And therefore the minig says goyim v'shleim mezalmin. In the Sefer of the same bracha, he has over there different shuvas from Shlomo Zalman, and over there in Kuf Samaches Ois Yud, he brings Shlomo Zalman said the minig is on Challah Kugel to make a mezainis. Now, I'm a little bit scared. Shlomo Zalman says over there they would take the bread anyways and soak it in water, and it would take a lot of the kishkas out of the bread, and the water would turn white. So, but these are things that you have to know exactly how everybody makes their challah kugel. If you make your challah kugel the way I just described, then the bracha would be a mezainis. Now, this over there.
Could Rav explain that again? What makes it a mezainis?
Number one, it seems they were soaking it to the extent that the water would become white, which we'll see in a moment, that idea. Number two is even without that, it seems that after they soaked it, they would knead it with the egg. Now, this is the point of the chiddush, because once it got soaked in the water, you could say there's not roiv mei paris, there's tons of water inside the bread. And that was Rosh Shlomo Zalman's chiddush, that he said the mayim that was nivla into the challah doesn't take away from the chshivas of that roiv mei paris, kloimar, the egg that it gets now stuck together with. And now that I stuck together these bits of challah and re-kneaded it, and then baked it, that itself is enough to take away the chshivas of those pieces of bread, and it doesn't really look like bread, anyone that looks at it. And therefore the bracha would be a mezainis. That's what Shlomo Zalman said. Now, I'm a little bit scared because it could change based on the process. I will give you over here the Eitzah of the Goyin Rishlam Zalman himself. In any of the cases that we're going to discuss today, that you're not sure, did I mafkia the Shema Moitzi or not? Very simple Eitzah. Take these pieces under Kazayas, cook them in a Kli Rishon. Kli Rishon for sure is Mevashal. Even not a Leish. No one argues on that. Put it in a Kli Rishon and put it in there. Shlomo Zalman says for a minute or half a minute. So if you take, let's say you don't know, we'll see in a minute, all different cases that this Eitzah is a great Eitzah. But let's say the Challah Kugel, you're not sure. So now you don't know, and you don't want to be have to wash on it, right? What does every good American want to be? He wants to be Pariv, he wants to be Upkedavint, and he wants to not have to bench. So Mamela, take the piece of bread, cut it into less than a kazayas, and then after you cut it into less than a kazayas, cook it. How are you going to cook it? Don't pour a Kli Rishon on it. Don't put it in a Kli Sheni. Don't put it into Kavish. All those things are sfekas. So put it into a Kli Rishon for how long? So Shlomo Zalman says a half a minute. I gotta found that to be a bit of a chiddush because the Chazon Ish told us we have to wait till Michael ben Drusai. So I don't know, maybe do it for a minute. But if you take a piece of challah under kazayas, put it inside a piece of inside boiling hot water of a Kli Rishon for a minute, and now afterward you put it together with egg, etc. There's no question that it's a mezainis and an alamechya because you cooked less than a kazayas, and that's the rule of the day. Cooking less than a kazayas is mafkia the shem pas. So that's what everybody say. Gavaldik Eitzah, you should remember, we'll see a lot of cases this helps us with. A lot of cases. Now, the next, now that you know the bracha on a piece of bread that you cook, now that you know the halacha on these croutons, at least theoretically, so now the shaila is, what is considered, we spoke about bishul and we spoke about Kli Rishon and irui and all of these different processes. Now the shaila is, what about tiggin? And tiggin is frying. Is oil any different? So now I want to make this very clear. The Mishnah Berurah in Sif Katan Samach test based on the Ramah and Sif Yudala that the Olam saw says, look, if you're putting a little bit of oil just that the pan shouldn't burn, that's not tiggin. That's called baking. And that's avada, no question. That has nothing to do, you didn't bishul it. If you take a piece of bread and you put some oil on the pan and you fry it up, even if it's less than a kazayas, avada tamoitzi. You did nothing to it. No shaila. If you take, on the same vein, if you take a pachas mikazayas, less than a kazayas, and now I digress for one moment. Very interesting thing. I keep on saying less than a kazayas, less than a kazayas, less than a kazayas. Everybody say, how much is a kazayas? Anybody know? So you're supposed to say, who knows? Chazon Ish, Chaim Noah, the Noda B'Yehuda didn't know. Over here, there's a beautiful Taz, Mamish in our Sugya. It's a Mitzvah Gedoyla. When the other gets a chance, take a look at the Taz on Sif Katan Yud, on Sif Yud. Gewaldige Mitzvah. The Taz says, and if you want to know what the kazayas, the Taz says it's pashut. Everybody knows what a kazayas is. Now, the Noda B'Yehuda lived, I don't know, 100 years later, something like that. Not so far away. He was in Prague, he was in Kruka, so they weren't so far away. And he says, kazayas? Everybody knows what a kazayas is. And the Noda B'Yehuda says, who knows what a kazayas is? Nishtana Tvayim, Nishtana Beitzin, Nishtana everything. Interesting. What happened in that 100 years? I don't know. But Al Kaponim, it comes out very interesting. What is the kazayas that we have to worry about? Maybe till now, we have a kazayas or Chaim Noah, Chazon Ish, some say 17 grams, you make it ala mechia. There's a whole book with pictures vegging them. Some say Chaim Volodin said 6 grams, etc. So what exactly is a kazayas? That's supposed to be pashut. But anyways, if you take a pachas mikazayas and you fry it with a drop of oil just that it shouldn't burn, no shaila, that's not called cooking. The other extreme is if I deep fry, I mentioned this before, and this is the Balatanya says in Sif Yud Zayin, that if you take, it's in the Sif Yud Zayin in Hagah, and in the Seder Brachos and in Parak Beis, Sif Yud Beis. If you take kazayas and you deep fry it, there's no kazayas, you deep fry it, no shaila, that's called bishul. Our shaila is regular, good old-fashioned tiggin, where you're not deep frying it and you're not putting on a drop. You're frying it in oil, a certain amount of oil, which isn't deep frying, so we can't consider it bishul. What is frying? It's frying in these halachas called baking. which doesn't remove the shame bread, or is frying so aggressive, it's like cooking, and therefore it does remove the shame of bread of elastic kazayis. Has to do also with the way that frying works. Some say that the metzias of how frying works, it doesn't go in mamish, it creates a film around it, and therefore that's ke'ein afiyah. So what's the din? So this is the suffix of Rabbeinu, the Mishnah Berurah, and Sivkotin Nun Vav. Over here, Mishnah Berurah doesn't know, and because of this, he starts with major chumras in Mishnah Berurah. He says if you take a bit less than a gazayas and you fry it, not deep fry it, but you fry it and not a tiny amount of oil, you tig in it. This is a suffix. You got to eat it only in a meal because Mishnah Berurah doesn't know. Obviously, if it's more than a gazayas, it's not worse than bishul. But over here, the chazayin ish in Chav Vav Siv Hey and in Siv Tes argues on the Chavetz Chaim, and he says it's not a suffix, it's vaday not bishul. He takes a very strong stand, and he says it's vaday not bishul. Unbelievable chazanish over here in Sivkotin Hey. He takes a strong stand. He says it's afiyah based on the lumdus that we said. The way tikkun works is it creates a film around it and doesn't.
Can I slow down
Therefore,
a little bit?
It's a birchas moitzi and mamish birchas hamazon, a birchas hamoitzi and a birchas hamazon, even less than a gazayas. What's enough?
We go on to page 183 for a second. I have to slow the road down a second here because I want to. I am seeing Mishnah Berurah on Tigun on 183, if that's possible.
Sivkotin Nun Vav.
Nun Vav, yes. And then
And Shartzi and Nun Beis, he says the words Sarchi and Lamaisa.
Nun Beis.
Shartzi and Nun Beis.
Nun Beis. Okay. Let's see. It's on page 183. I don't see the Sarchi in Nun Beis.
At the last words on the Shartzi.
Oh, the Shartzi. Ois Nun Beis.
Ois Nun Beis, yeah.
Can we start with the Mishnah Berurah
Sure.
in Nun Vav?
She says, "Lefi das shari achreinim ein hechreach lidvarav." It's not a clear thing. This, if you were tigging the mashke, it's not clear. In other words, do we say that the entire lechem leibt iber?
So therefore, tigun, what we call frying matzah bride,
frying, not deep frying, and not just a little tiny drop.
So we call matzah bride. The Mishnah Berurah says you can't.
Oh,
eat.
So I'm getting now to the matzah bride. That'll be the nafkamina lemaisa.
So the machlekes in Mishnah Berurah and the Chazon Ish here, is that the issue?
Correct. The Chazon Ish over here takes a very hard line in Sivkotin Hey, argues on the Mishnah Berurah, and says the psak halacha on tiggin is that it does not mafkia the shame of the bread unless in a gazais.
This is not the one in Tes. We have.
This is the one in Siman Chav Vav, Sivkotin Hey. It's also in Siv Tes. He alludes to it in Siv Tes, but it's in Sivkotin Hey.
We don't have it. We only have Tes. We have Hayat Salanu and we have Tes. Okay.
No, Tes also, and Tes he also mentions it. He says it as an agav. It was pashut him by this point that tiggin is considered not a bishul, but you see he takes it on pashut, makes an afkamina there.
In Tes,
he talks about matzah bride. He mamish talks about matzah bride.
Yeah, matzah bride. Matzah and the tignois. He talks about mamish matzah bride.
Yeah.
Right?
Matzah bride. He mamish says matzah bride. And he's coming to argue on the Mishnah Berurah. This is the famous Chazon Ish on matzah bride that comes to argue on the Chavetz Chaim.
Okay.
So now, what's an afkamina? So we'll go in order. Let's go to French toast. We'll go one by one. French toast, a regular yid comes on a Motzei Shabbos from Malav Malka. He was careful with his bread, and he on challah he separated it at the table, like Rav Moshe says, so that he shouldn't have a problem. It would be fleishiks. He cut himself a slice now. He takes it, he puts on it the egg and dust, and he puts it in a frying pan. There's no shaila in the world that that's still a moitzi, because it's more than a gazayis. He decides to make an interesting type of a French toast, more of a matzah bride type of French toast. He cuts it up into a bunch of little pieces. We'll make them tiny pieces because everybody knows what pachas mikazayis is. He then dips it in egg and he fries it like that. What's the halacha? The halacha is if he deep fries it, so then in chanami, lost the shame, pass 100%. It's mezainis, and that's he's not going to be yotzei washing from malav malka like the Mishnah Berurah says is a mitzvah lechatchila. If it's a tiny drop of oil just to make it that it doesn't burn, l'chayra, it's a maitzi. If it's fried, French toast that's fried, so then the bracha is going to be a suffix. Lefi the Mishabura. Lefi the Chazon Ish, there's no suffix. Why? Because it's Vadai 100% Amaitzi. Tiggin doesn't mafkia. Now, I was just misupik a little bit. Mishabura talks about oil over here. Is that the same thing by egg? I think it's only by oil what the Mishabura means. And therefore, let's say he takes a tiny bit of oil. Most people, when they make French toast, they're not putting on tons of oil, they're making a little bit of oil, just that it shouldn't burn. And then they put the egg. The chayra, even if he were to have cut it up, it would still be it would still remain amaitzi. According to the Chazon Ish, of course it's amaitzi. But even according to Mishabura, the chayra in that case, it would be amaitzi, which really brings us to the big nafkamina of matzah brai. And this is exactly what the Chazon Ish is coming to say. He says, if you take matzah and it's more than a kazayis, even the Chafetz Chaim is going to agree that it's going to be a moitzi. Now, by matzah brai, of course, this is extremely negeya, because the people that make matzah brai, they cut it up into tiny pieces. You don't make matzah brai one huge piece of matzah. You cut it up into tons of pieces. You put inside the oil, the egg, etc. So now, if you're just putting on a tiny bit of oil that it shouldn't burn avad, it's a maitzi. If the pieces are bigger than the kazayas, of course, it's a maitzi. But if you make regular matzah brai the regular way, so then it's little pieces and it's fried in oil, and the oil is, I don't know, deep fried, but certainly a lot of oil there. So therefore, what's the bracha? The Chafetz Chaim says, I don't know. And the Chazon Ish says it's a maitzi. Now, very interesting. And therefore, the Chafetz Chaim says you should only have it in a meal. You have to wash on the matzah. It's very interesting. The Chafetz Chaim was Mesupik. The Chazon Ish was Vadai. Ramosha Sternbach, Zayin Gesund, in Chelik Gimel, Siman Kuf Memei, I say, he has a new gedank, he has a new way of looking at it. He says the whole Machlekes Mishnah and the Chafetz Chaim is by bread. But he says not by matzah. He says when it comes to matzah, very interesting idea. He says when it comes to matzah, matzah is not easily changed by a tiggin process. I'll read you his words. Dafka lecha mishtana bebishul. It's only by bread that gets changed by cooking. And it gets mamish soft until the point that it mamish falls apart, bread falls apart. And therefore you could say it turns into mezainis. And also by tiggin, the Chafetz Chaim is mistapik, because maybe it's like a bishul, right? But he says, mashenkein by matzah, even after you fry matzah with egg and oil and everything, he says, it's a vada, doesn't lose the tzura so much. It's still very daima to what it used to be. He says, Nicker Hativ, it's very clearly distinct that it's matzah, and therefore he says, you should make a moitzi. He writes, Shuv, I found in the Chazon Ish that says, Pashit, that matzah shenitkana is even if it's less than a kazayis, is taka hamoitzi. But again, Abai say, he doesn't, the Chazon Ish didn't mean like Ramesh Sternbach. The Chazon Ish meant because always Tiggin, the Chazon Ish and Sifkat and Hay Paskind, was not a mafkia of the shame bread. But the Ramesh Sternbach comes with a new svar that by matzah, it's going to take a lot more to mafkia from the shame bread. Now, I don't know how pashut this is, because we saw that the Mishabura in Siman Tav Samach Aleph compared the sugis of matzah and bread and did not make chalukim. And therefore, this to me is a tremendous chiddush. But Akapan, one thing is bar that in Bnei Brak, matzah brai is hamoitzi. In I suppose we'll say it like this. In Bnei Brak, it's hamoitzi because he doesn't have the suffix of the Chafetz Chaim. In the Chassidische Welt, matzah brai is treif, okay, HBrachos, and in the, I guess in Radin, and the rest of the Welt we'll call it. So then matzah brai, if it's fried in oil, less than a kazayas, it's a suffix, and you should only eat it in a meal. What should you do? You should do like Rosh Shlomo Zalman. Take the pieces of matzah, less than a kazayas, put them in a kli rishon for 1 minute, and then according to everybody, it's a mezainis. Even the Chazon Ish would agree. In this case, it's a mezainis. And then you can eat pounds and pounds of matzah brai. And like we said, if you get out of the hospital, you'll make on it only in alamechya.
We'll say you don't have to have the whole thing mevushal, just one piece.
No, you take all the matzah, break it up into little pieces of matzalach, and then put it into a kli rishon. Let it soak there until a minute. I don't know if you put them all in, it might cool it down. But you basically take a matzah, cut it up into less than a kazayas, cook it in water, for a minute or whatever, and then afterward fry it. And then make the matzah brai like that. It's not going to affect the taste of the matzah brai. I gave this eitzah last year, and someone told me, HaRav, it tastes even better. And then the brachos mezainis and alamechia pashit according to all the paiskim.
Sounds easier to wash. Okay.
I said this eitzah last year, and somebody did it, but he didn't do it the way I said it. And he just took the matzah, broke it up into a bunch of pieces, and poured boiling hot water all over the matzah. That's a mistake, because that's irui. Unless you want to say that maybe now it's a sveika. The person called me and asked me this shaila. I said maybe it's a sveika. Suffix number one is that irui itself is like bishul. Suffix number two is that maybe tikkun is like bishul. You put both of them together. So if you already did it, mistama, you'd make a mezainis and an al-michya, and that much you maybe wouldn't have to eat in the middle of a matzah meal. Pardon my friend.
Okay, I think I'm speaking for everybody. Would the Rav mind giving us a chazara here, because we're a little confused. So let's.
My pleasure.
Okay.
So it's like this. The basic idea you have to remember always is less than a kazayas has to have a processing. How do you get rid of the shame bread? Yeah, it was Kallus shame lechem. How does the shame lechem get mufka? So let's go in order. If you take the bread, all different processing to this bread that I could do to take away the shame bread. Number one is I could break it up and grind it up into a flour. Did that get rid of the shame bread? That, said the Shulchan Aruch in Sif Tes, in Sif Yud, in Shulchan Aruch Tav Samech Aleph, in Sif Daled, the Biur Halacha brings us down. If all you did was grind it up, it remains a piece of matzah meal, breadcrumb, hamoitzi, wash the Netilas Yadayim, and make a Brachos HaMazon if you have a kazayas, and you can be yotzei the mitzvah of matzah. And even if you take it with some water, it didn't change the tzura, it didn't change it, you didn't have in the water for a while, and therefore the Brachos HaMoitzi and the Brachos HaMazon. That's the least aggressive processing to a piece of bread of less than a kazayas, and therefore it did not affect the shame hamoitzi. The next step that you always have to remember your whole life is that when you're more than a kazayas, you can't lose the shame hamoitzi. And we saw that to din daraisa. Ad kidei kach, that the Chafetz Chaim said in Hilchos Pesach that the only reason you can't be yotzei matzah is because it doesn't have a tam matzah. So you can cook it, you can do whatever you want to it. If it's more than a kazayas, whatever a kazayas is, you can't lose the shem hamoitzi. The whole starting point of the shiur today is less than a kazayas, and you're doing some aggressive form of processing. One aggressive form of processing is cooking. If you cook less than a kazayas piece of bread, it is no longer a moitzi. What's called cooking? It's not enough. Maybe an iro is a suffix, maybe klishen is a suffix, but kli rishon or cooking, anything less than a kazayas takes away the shame moitzi. And remember that, Rabbi Yisai, because that's some weird theoretical case. It's a loga lemaisa and eitzah to get out of any sfeikis. Anytime you have a suffix, take the matzah, break it up into less than a kazayas, cook it for a minute, and then do whatever you want. And it is not a moitzi, it's mezainis. And even if you eat thousands of it, it will remain in alamechia. Something to remember. And that everyone agrees. So far, everything I said is pashit. The next shlav is that, let's say I take a matzah, a piece of bread, and it's less than a kazayis, and I don't cook it. I fry it. And when I say fry, I don't mean a little drop of oil, because that's not called frying. And I don't mean deep frying, because that's called cooking. I mean, you fry it, what we call in a frying pan, oil. So if you take less than a kazayis, and you fry it in oil, ma dinoi. This question, if you don't know the answer, you're in good company, because the Mishabur also does not know the answer to the question. The Chazanish knew the answer. He said, tiggin is not called the cooking. Tiggin, frying, is not called cooking, and it's called baking. And therefore, you didn't remove the shem hamoitzi and said bleibt hamoitzi. And therefore, he says matzah brai in all cases is hamoitzi. Of course, if it's a kazayas, even if it's less than a kazayas, all you're doing is frying it, you're not deep frying it, it's hamoitzi. The Chafetz Chaim doesn't know. In Sivkot in Nun Vav, in Shartzi and Nun Beis, he does not know what's the status of tiggin. So therefore, he says only eat it in a meal if it's under a kazayas and you tiggined it. Therefore, I gave the eitzah today that when you want to make matzah brai, take it and cook it for a minute first in a kli rishon under kazayas in pieces, and then go and do your heart's desire. Go and fry it up. Your matzah brai is into hate. The chasidim, it's treif. The Chazanish b'nei Brachos, it's no matter what a mezainis unless you did my eights of the cooking. But the Chofetz Chaim didn't know what to do. So what do? Cook these little pieces of kazayis in water for less than a minute, something. And then afterward, make your matzah bright, and then it's a mezainis and basayf and alamechya. That's the basic in a nutshell of sikum. I just mentioned one more thing. Is that clear, first of all?
Yeah.
I want to mention one more nekuda. Is the Chazanish and Chazanish and Chavav Ois Hey, Sivkat Nei and Dibra Matzah Yotzei. Very interesting Chazanish. He's going on a suffix of the Bir Alacha in Dibra Maschal Im that the Bir Alacha brings the Pri Megadim in Ois Kav Ches. That the Pri Megadim says that, let's say we've been talking the whole time that I took a kazayis and I cooked it. You didn't take away the shame bread. Kazayis, cooked it. You didn't take away the shame lechem. The Pri Megadim says, what if I cook it, a kazayis, and then afterward I break it? Before I eat it, I cook it, and then I break it. We would have thought you didn't lose the shame bread because you have to cook it when it was less than a kazayis to remove the shame lechem. The Bir Alacha doesn't know the answer to this. Very interesting suffix. In Lumdis, it's a very, very hard suffix to understand. In Lumdis, it's not such a understandable suffix. I cooked it, and I didn't mafkiya the shame bread. The Bir Alacha is not sure. And unbelievably, the Chazanish in Chavav Oisei takes on the tzad that we would have said the fakert from. Chazanish says, no, if you cook a kazayis and then you break it in half, that's already called that it lost the shame pass. Unbelievable. Very hard to understand. In Lumdis, how does the processing, you cooked it more than a kazayis, it didn't take away the shame lechem, and now you broke it in half? And then even more shver in Lumdis, the Chazanish says, unless you cook it more than kazayis, break it, and then immediately eat it. Because he says, that can't be that it won't have the chashivas of bread. He proves it. He says, what do you mean? Because if I take a kazayis that I cook and then I put it in my mouth, already you're about to bite it. And when you bite it, it's going to be less than a kazayis when you swallow it. So you see that it can't be that at that point it makes enough kamina. It must be that if you cooked it and then broke it and then waited and then ate it, that it would be a mezainis. But if you miyad eat it, then for sure you see that it remains with the shame hamoitzi. So therefore, even if right before you put it into your mouth, now this is a very difficult thing to understand. All over Hilchos, Brachos, and Kashrus, we find that the chshivas of the shame of a big thing, of a beria, is what it was like when it went into your mouth. So why is there a raya from when I went into my mouth to what it is when it's outside my mouth? I must tell you, this is something I do not understand, and I find it very, very, very difficult. The one thing that we didn't discuss today is that we did not discuss Kneidlach, but based on this sugya and the Mishabura, Taka says this in Sivkat and test. He says, based on what you learned today, Kneidlach is matzah, flour, basically, breadcrumbs, that were put back together with egg, that have no tzarisa de nahama, that are all less than a kazayis, and that they're cooked. So he says, of course, it's a mezainis.
Why is it less than a kazayis? Why is it less than a kazayis? The big kneidl is less than a kazayis.
We done at the shlav of when it was broken up.
You mean the matzah meal? How much matzah meal went in to make each kneidl? Correct? That's what the Rav means?
Correct. But again,
the original,
we don't don the kneidl again. We don the flour. We don the flour when it's being put together. So you're putting together.
Pesach, it's matzah meal. It's matzah meal, right? Because it make a difference if flour or matzah meal? Does it make a difference? Of course.
No, flour for sure. If it's real emes flour, then for Shtetzach, that's going to be a mezainis. It never got the shame of bread. I'm talking even when you're using matzah meal, if it's a moga hat the shame bread.
Right. We're talking about matzah meal. So that's a kneidl is not a kazayis?
A kneidl is definitely a kazayis. But
a kneidl is less than a kazayis? I can eat. You're telling me a chaylik can eat a kneidl in Yom Kippur?
No. I'm talking about the kneidl once it was put together. I'm talking about before it was put together. So when you take it, you take a dot and you're putting it together. So that at that point, it doesn't have the tzarisa de nahama.
Understood. So l'maisa knedel, you ate knedel and with soup. What's the l'maisa now?
Knedel is mezainis, and if you ate 50 of them, still alamichya.
Nice. And this what about the soup? Do you have to make a shakal on the soup?
So that's a big shiloh. It depends if you're eating knedel with every single bite, you're eating some soup and there's only a tiny bit left. So then in a chanami, then it'll be a nicker and a tuffle. But usually it's not the case. Usually person has a big knedel and then he has a lot of soup. Usually, if he has a suffix, you should pater. I mean, one day Mitzvah Shem will learn Reshut Beis. We'll learn these halachas, but the Derek Klal, most people have sometimes you have a crouton soup and you turn tons of croutons in. And economy there is probably mezainis because it's like the cereal shiloh. You just have a little bit of liquid at the end.
What about stuffing?
The stuffing is too difficult to go into because it depends how they're making the stuffing. I'm saying, if they're making it like the challah kugel, then it's like we described.
So it depends on the mitzias of what they.
Yeah, I mean the Maisa, the real Emistika Litvaks, they make matzah bread on Pesach, which will be hamaitzi, right? If they take flour and water and bake it afterward, flour meaning matzah meal. I don't mean chalila flour. I mean matzah meal and water and bake it, and they make matzah cake, matzah bread. So then it'll be hamaitzi. If they make matzah cake, they put it together with mei Paris and bake it. That the Mishabura says it'll be a mezainis in the nalamechi unless you eat enough, and then it turns into hamaitzi.
So the shiloh only is on the Mishabura's suffix only on the frying with the chaznish. That's not if it's cooked, only on the frying.
Absolutely.
Okay, so
and baking
we
is also
everyone.
partial.
We covered the whole thing. We covered matzah brai, challah kugel. The Rav spoke about kneidlach. What kneidlach?
Absolutely everything.
And the stuffing. So okay, we covered everything. Yasher koyach.